Good evening, you're watching TVP World on the Record with me, Aaron Dahmen. From Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine to suspected acts of sabotage across the continent, Europe is on edge. The common threat? Moscow. And as a battle for the Baltic Sea brews north of Poland, Sweden is one of the countries preparing for the worst, scaling up arms production and warning its own citizens to be ready for war. So where is the red line? Tonight we go on the record with Sweden's Minister of Defence, Paul Jonson. But first, a short report.
The Baltic Sea is often referred to as a NATO lake. After its invasion of Ukraine, Russia's actions pushed both Sweden and Finland into the Transatlantic bloc, leaving Moscow as the only non-aligned state on the Baltic shores. Its access to the sea has been reduced to just two ports, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. And perhaps that's exactly why this narrow stretch of water has become such a tempting target for the Kremlin. The number of documented attacks has surged from 6 in 2022 to 44 last year. Power lines, gas pipelines and internet cables have been hit across the region. Finland blamed a Chinese ship for damaging the Baltic Connector pipeline. Sweden confirmed sabotage of its undersea cable. And GPS jamming from Kaliningrad has disrupted air traffic over the Baltic.
We are obviously not at war, but obviously not at peace either.
And it's not limited to the sea. Last year, Warsaw's Marywilska shopping centre, one of the biggest in Poland, went up in flames. Police say it was sabotage ordered by Russian intelligence. The operation was run through Telegram. Local recruits were paid to set the fire. Over 1,400 small businesses were wiped out in one night.
We have no doubt that the activity of the Russian services, also cooperating with the Belarusian services, is very high, and there is no point in fooling ourselves here.
So could this be more than just provocation, a strategy to destabilise Europe and test NATO's resolve? The evidence may speak for itself.
And Swedish Defence Minister Paul Jonson joins me now from Stockholm. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So can I start with your Prime Minister's comments in that report? He said earlier this year, we're not at war, but we're not at peace. What does that mean? Does Sweden believe that Europe, more broadly NATO, should be preparing for armed conflict or should be preparing for a World War III?
Well, my Prime Minister echoed also what Secretary General Rutte has said in December already. I think one of the things you have to take into consideration is we're heavily exposed to hybrid threats and hybrid operations. It could be disinformation, it could be cyber attacks, it could be cyber espionage, it could be foreign direct investment into critical infrastructure, or it can be pure acts of sabotage that we see that we are predominantly being conducted by Russia, but we also identified both China and Iran as intelligence threat force as well. So we are in one way in the gray zone between peace and war, and we of course now have to invest heavily into strengthening our armed forces, but also strengthening our resilience against hybrid operations.
To be clear, does your evidence suggest that Russia is behind a number of sabotage attacks across Europe?
Well, I think that's been fairly well documented in Poland, in the Baltic states and the UK and so forth. And also the Secretary General of NATO has stated that. So we see definitely a change in behavior from Russia since the full-scale invasion broke out, that Russia has a propensity to take big political and military risks, that it's been stepping up its hybrid activities in around Europe for sure.
Now, I want to expand on this talk of a wartime scenario. Polish Prime Minister Radosław Sikorski, he told me a couple of months ago that Poland is sufficiently scared of Russia, given the country's proximity. Back home in Sweden, you've handed out pamphlets to citizens titled in case of crisis or war. Is Sweden now also acting accordingly with some fear of Russian threats that something might happen?
We're not afraid, we're not worried. And of course, Russia's narrative is trying to scare us from supporting Ukraine, and Russia will not be successful in this endeavor. But we actually sent out that pamphlet in the first version already in 2017. And that was a wise choice because it increased the awareness of the Swedish public that the security situation has been deteriorated, that we have to be prepared if the worst things could happen. And there is a strong willingness in Sweden also to continue investing in our armed forces and investing in our defense capabilities. And of course, we look to the excellent Polish leadership, of course, being the best in Europe when it comes to Article 3 work and beefing up the armed forces. And this is absolutely necessary. And we do this in order to strengthen NATO's capability to defend and deter. And we do that, of course, to make sure that there will not be any confusion on the Russian side in regards to our determination to uphold the Swedish territorial integrity and our allies' territorial integrity.
Now, of course, the Baltic Sea has become somewhat of a home ground for some of these suspected sabotage attempts, as you mentioned, likely linked to Moscow. Those reports of cutting undersea cables have died down in recent months. Are there any investigations ongoing into more recent incidents? And if not, why do you think that is?
Let me first say we monitor the situation on the Baltic Sea very closely, and we have assets and capabilities working on the surface. We operate with our 4 submarines. We're stepping up now to having 5 submarines, and we work in the air as well, both with our intelligence gathering and our radar surveillance capabilities. So we have a good situational awareness, and we see, of course, that the Baltic Sea has become more important for Russia at any time. On the Baltic Sea now, there's about 4,500 vessels operating the whole time. And Russia is more dependent on the Baltic Sea now as well. So what we've predominantly been focusing also in identifying fleets that are connected with the shadow fleet as well, in order to identify more of those and put those on the sanction list. And then we, of course, follow the incidents as well. There's been about 15 cables all in all through 4 major incidents who's been affected by this. And we take note of this and we increase our awareness and situation awareness. We collaborate very closely also internationally among the countries around the Baltic Sea in order to mitigate the risk that this will happen further on in the future.
And I want to get into that cooperation in Baltic Century in just a moment. First, I want to play you a soundbite from your colleague, the Swedish Foreign Minister. Let's have a look.
It's about hostile acts aimed at imposing Russia's will on us, NATO, the EU and Sweden. It's about letter bombs that could have exploded on aircraft, arson and attempted murder, energy wars, exploitation of migrants and migrant flows, electoral manipulation, thinly veiled nuclear threats. It is no coincidence that the majority of attacks target states on the front line, such as our Baltic neighbors, Finland and Poland. What is happening is thus an attack both on the West's support to Ukraine and on NATO's defense capabilities. The aim is for us to abandon our support to Ukraine, for us to believe that the costs and risks are too high. And by weakening NATO and the EU politically, the aim is to create scope for military action for Russia.
Now, obviously, the Minister mentions threats beyond just the Baltic Sea, so migrant manipulation, letter explosives and others. We've also had reports out of Germany this week that 3 people have been arrested for planning Russian sabotage attacks. Is this all about Vladimir Putin, about Russia trying to destabilise the EU and NATO?
Yeah, definitely, and also to scare us from supporting Ukraine. But we're going to continue supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, and this is really an investment into our own security, because there is right now, in my book, it's the Ukrainians who are a shield against Russian military expansion, and therefore we've provided the support for the Ukrainians for about 8 billion euros, and we're ready, of course, to do much more as well. And I think that's because the future of the whole European security order right now is being decided in eastern Ukraine. And that's why we're so committed to supporting the Ukraine as well. So Putin won't be stopped until someone stops him. And right now it's the Ukrainians who are doing that job.
Talking of NATO, how is the relationship with the US, a huge player in the alliance, changing with the Donald Trump administration, with the new guard in the White House? Is Europe trying to now get its own house in order in case the US pulls the plug completely?
Let me say we have very good bilateral defense cooperations with the United States, and it's continuing to do that. What is now happening also, of course, is that the new administration is much more forward-leading in pushing the Europeans to take a greater responsibility for the security on the European continent, and that's basically a good thing because we've been so addicted to the US doing that, and we want to continue the US collaboration. So I don't want less US in Europe, but I want more Europe, so to speak, and that we have to step up our act. And I think that the good things have been happening the last couple of months, an awakening which is long overdue. Of course, we doubled our defense budget in 4 years, and we're committed to continue doing whatever it takes also to continue keeping Europe safe. But for sure, I think there is an increased awareness right now that we have to rise to the occasion, and we have to step up our defense investment and make sure that those defense investments are transformed into combat capabilities.
Because I guess the question is, whenever we discuss a potential attack on NATO countries, Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, everyone is safe, and that sounds reassuring. What I'm interested in is your view. At this time of volatility when it comes to the Trump administration, can we really be sure that the US would come to, say, Latvia or Lithuania or Poland or Sweden's aid?
Yes, both because, of course, the US on all levels have confirmed that Article 5 is there and that the US is committed to Article 5. That's something we greatly appreciate. But this is also combined with a very extensive US military presence in Europe, which is right now at an all-time high from the last couple of decades at least, and which we are grateful for. And you can also see that the European pillar of NATO, so to speak, is now also stepping up its defense investment a lot, which is absolutely necessary as well, both because we need a stronger Europe, but it's also in a good way also to assure the transatlantic link. So it's healthy that there is a pressure on the US side for Europeans, since we have spent decades of underinvestment into our defense capabilities. And you also see a much more extensive regional collaboration as well, and not at least in Northern Europe. We collaborate very closely among the 5 Nordic countries, but also with the Baltic countries, and more also with Poland. I think I want to make sure that defense investment in this region is going up.
And let's talk about that cooperation. I want to put a map up now on our screen. It first shows the Nordefco security format of the Scandinavian countries, and then the Baltic Sentry, NATO's maritime policing operation. So there you can see the Nordic Defence Cooperation members, so Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Iceland. And now we will show you the Baltic Sentry mission, which of course was somewhat Poland's idea and established earlier this year through NATO. Given the uncertainty over the US, the EU facing challenges to now really ramp spending up, to ramp unity up in a way, even in the face of the likes of Hungary, is it time for the Nordic-Baltic countries and Poland to come together on some form of defence treaty, not just cooperation and a Nordic-Baltic summit, but actually an agreement that if an attack happens or there are issues that come up, that these countries are able to be somewhat self-autonomous?
Yeah, well, let me first say also there is an awareness and also an understanding in Europe that the facing threat for the United States is the developments in the Pacific and particularly China. And we've been aware of that for a long time, but I think now with the new US administration and the forced posture review that they're undertaking, that this could have consequences. So that's also a reason why we're stepping up. The Nordic-Baltic region has never been stronger than this today, and the big game changer was Sweden and Finland joining NATO, because it redraws the map fundamentally. It means that Sweden can be a staging and basing area also for assuring a better ability to deter and defend both Finland, the Baltic states and Poland. So it enhances the possibilities for regional cooperation, and we are working very closely right now on establishing good and strong defense plans which are executable, which can demand more cooperation when it comes to military mobility and transport corridors, and we are working much more on joint procurement. So I think there's a lot of things happening in this region, both when it comes to defense investment, but also when it comes to defense planning. So we want this to be a hard target, and that Russia will not be tempted to in any way infringe on our territorial integrity. And of course, it's all for one and or one for all in this ballgame.
So when it comes to that defence planning, could that look like a formal coalition between the Nordic-Baltic countries, between Poland, when it comes to defence?
Well, we have NATO and we have Article 5 and we have a common defense planning. And I think there is already a solidarity among all the 32 allies. So that is, of course, the NATO is our go-to nation. But then you can have sub-regional cooperation like we have with the MB8 and with the NEFCO and so forth. But that is actually mutually reinforcing for making NATO stronger. It's in the interest of the alliance as such that this region is having effective cross-border training, that it has a high degree of military mobility, and that there's a strong ability to defend and defend. So it's not a regionalization of NATO as such, but it strengthens the alliance as in its whole, I would say.
So NATO remains the flagship. Sweden is one of the world's largest arms exporters, you're 13th, and in January you noted, quote, "We will have to take some risks to build a stronger defence capability faster than usual." What could Sweden's role look like in defending the region or providing a deterrence in the region, because Sweden's arms industry is scaling up fast?
Yeah, and I think that's a lesson learned from the war in Ukraine, a war of attrition, which pretty much what's going on in Ukraine. A war of attrition is a war of warehouses, and therefore you need a strong defense industrial base. That's part of credible deterrence. We're fortunate to have a strong defense industrial base, since there's no other country of 10 million who has the capability to design and produce everything from fighter jets to submarines, advanced IFVs and artillery systems, and very advanced sensor technology. And so I think when it comes to innovation, I think we have things to bring to the alliance. When it comes to ramping up the defense industrial production, that we have good capabilities there as well, which could be good and important for the alliance. And we bring into the alliance also operational depth and a good staging and basing area. We have, if I would point out two areas where I think we have unique capabilities. One is in the Baltic Sea. There we have, as I said early on, we have both submarines, we have surface vessels, we have quite advanced aerial capabilities, and then also we have subarctic capabilities up in the north. It's always one thing to up in the north to be able to survive in that cold weather and all that snow and ice, but another to have the ability to fight. And our armed forces have both those capabilities. So I think those are some of the assets and capabilities that we have brought into the alliance since we became an ally 16 months ago. And let me just say that our ambition when we joined NATO was to hit the ground running. So I'm proud that we now have a mechanized battalion in Latvia. I'm proud that we are the framework nation for FLF in Finland, NATO's activities for defense and deterrence inside in Finland. And we're very proud, of course, to have our Gripen fighters right now based in Poland. And our naval ships are operating in Baltic Century, which is a naval maritime NATO activities going on. None of that would have been possible 16 months ago before we joined the alliance. So now we can also be a security provider into NATO as well. We didn't just join NATO to get security guarantees, but also to contribute to and project stability.
Now, of course, as you pointed out, a number of lessons from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So let's just briefly talk about Ukraine. You've called for peace by the end of 2025. Is a just peace possible by the end of the year? We've seen so much back and forth. President Trump, President Zelensky, President Putin, will they meet? Will they not meet? Will the officials meet? Do you see a just peace happening genuinely by the end of the year?
Listen, no one wants peace more than the Ukrainian people, and they deserve it. But it has to, as you said, be a just peace and not a bad peace, because a bad peace would only embolden Russia and weaken Ukraine. Therefore, the conditions on how this peace is attained is so important for us. And our focus right now is not on the negotiations as such, but it's actually on front-loading our Ukrainian support so Ukraine can negotiate from a position of strength. So that's what we're laser focused on. So just for 2025, we have provided decisions for supporting the Ukrainians with 3 billion euros, and we stand ready to also to do more. So I think that the best thing we can do right now is to increase our support to Ukraine, so we put maximum pressure on the Russians so they realize that they will not be successful in Ukraine.
Would Sweden send troops, peacekeeping troops, in the case of a ceasefire?
Yeah, well, we don't exclude that possibility, and of course we participated in this coalition of the willing meetings, and we have said there's 3 conditions that has to be met. One is some sort of U.S. engagement into such a mission, and then it's important that it has a clear rules of engagement, so we know what the exact purpose of it would be. And then, of course, it's also important that we take into account NATO's other activities for deterrence and defense as well. But if these conditions are met, then Sweden could certainly consider contributing.
And lastly, we've spoken about Russian threats, about defence, arms, security. When it comes to Ukraine, how much does the nature of this peace deal set a precedent for the world order? You mentioned China earlier. How much is this crucial, the nature of this deal, what it looks like, the fact that it's a just peace, when it comes to sending, like I say, a message not just to Moscow, but, say, to Beijing?
This is the security challenge of our generation, to get Ukraine right, to make sure that it's Ukrainians and Ukraine who's successful and not Russia, because this will have major global ramifications. We talk about also what's happening in the Euro-Atlantic region, but this could have ramification also for the Indo-Pacific region. And I fear that if Russia would be successful in Ukraine, it could also embolden other totalitarian states. So the connections between what's happening in Ukraine will have wider ramification for the future of the European security order, and it will have also global implications. So the stakes are enormous, and that's why we're so focused on supporting Ukraine. So I think that's this is certainly a challenge for our generation, to make sure it's the Ukrainians and not Putin who's successful in this war.
Is that a really legitimate fear for people to have, that if this peace deal isn't just, that it will embolden not just people like Vladimir Putin, but others too?
I think that there are many dictators around the world who are looking right now at the Western resolve and our tenacity and our resilience in supporting Ukraine. And that, of course, Putin underestimated 3 things. He underestimated the will to fight of the Ukrainian armed forces. He underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian population, and he underestimated the Western support to Ukraine. And it's for us to make sure that he's right also on the Western will to continue supporting Ukraine so they can negotiate from a position of strength. So this certainly could have global ramifications, and it will be an important linchpin of the future European security order, where Putin wants to have a Europe where might gives right, and create these kinds of buffered spheres or spheres of interest. And we don't want a Europe like that, and we don't want our kids to grow up in Europe like that.
Sweden's Minister of Defence, Pål Jonson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's all for this week's edition of On the Record. Do stay with us here on TVP World. Adam Yasser will be back next week. I'm Aaron Dahmen.